Hello everyone and welcome to the chapter number 63 of Blender Master Course Advanced Level of Particles. In this chapter, we'll be understanding some advanced concepts related to the particle systems like the particle interactions, force effect on particles, then we'll also be understanding about the hair particles and the different settings available in the hair particles. And for anyone who is new to this course, you can watch the previous 63 chapters from the link of the playlist given in the pinned comment. Now the first topic for today's chapter is the interaction of particles with other objects. And to understand this concept, first of all, I'll delete this cube object, so press X to delete, then press Shift plus A, go to Mesh and add a UV sphere. Let's move it up in the Z axis and place it over here. Now we'll be applying the particle system to this UV sphere in the scene, and for this, go to the particle settings, then click on this plus button in order to create a particle system. Now if I press the space bar to play the animation, then you can see here that the particles are being emitted from the UV sphere and they are falling in the downward direction due to the effect of gravity. But suppose you want that instead of falling downwards, these particles should interact with an object in the scene, for example a plane, and then either bounce back or remain attached to that plane surface. And doing this thing with particles is called the particle interaction. Let's add a plane in the scene, so press Shift plus A, go to Mesh and select the plane object. Tab into the edit mode, press S to scale it up. Now what we basically want is that all these particles emitting from the UV sphere should interact with the plane, and to achieve this result, we need to do some changes in the physics properties of this plane object. So first of all, go to the physics properties by clicking on this icon, and here you have some properties related to physics in Blender which we'll be understanding in the upcoming chapters of this course. But for now, we want that the particles which are being emitted from the UV sphere should collide with this plane, and therefore we'll be applying the collision physics to the plane in the scene. So for this, left click on the collision physics, and now we have this collision applied to the plane object, which means that if I take the pointer back to the frame number 1 and press the space bar to play the animation, then now the collision physics will work, and as a result, all the particles falling on the plane will collide with it and bounce back. Now in the collision physics, we have several settings. However, since we are dealing with the particles, so we only need to focus on these settings in the particle category. So the first setting that we have here is the permeability, and it basically means the probability that a particle will pass through a mesh. With its value set to 0, none of these particles would be able to pass through the plane. However, if I increase the permeability value to 0.5, then in this case, almost half of the particles colliding with the plane would be able to pass through it. So if I take the pointer back to the frame number 1 and press the space bar to play the animation, then you can see here that some of the particles are colliding with the plane and bouncing back, while the other particles are passing through the plane. So this is the use of the permeability. Also, if I increase its value to the maximum of 1, then in this case, all of the particles will pass through the plane. So let's take the pointer back to the frame number 1, and if I press the space bar to play the animation, then now you can see that with the permeability value set to 1, all the particles are passing through the plane and not colliding with the plane. For now, I'll change the permeability value to 0, and the next setting that you have is the stickiness. And as the name suggests, it basically defines the amount of stickiness on the collision object. By default, it is set to a value of 0, and as a result, there is no stickiness on the plane object. So if I take the pointer back to the frame number 1 and press the space bar to play the animation, then none of the particles will get stick to the plane surface and all of them will bounce back. However, if I increase the stickiness value to the maximum value of 10, then in this case, all of the particles will get stick to the surface of the plane. And to see it practically, let's take the pointer back to the frame number 1 and play the animation again. Now it's clearly visible that none of the particles is bouncing back due to the collision with the plane, but instead of that, they are sticking on the plane surface. For now, I'll reduce the stickiness value back to 0, and then the next option that you have here is the kill particles. And if I turn it on, then now all the particles that will fall on the plane object will get killed, or they will simply disappear. So let's again take the pointer back to the frame number 1 and replay the animation, and now in this case, none of the particles are bouncing back and not even getting stick to the plane surface. They are simply getting disappeared because of enabling the kill particles in the collision setting. Then the next setting that you have is the damping, and it basically controls the amount of damping during the particle collision. It's very similar to the stickiness parameter, because if I increase it to its maximum value of 1 and replay the animation by pressing the space bar, then you will notice that just like the stickiness parameter, this damping parameter is also making the colliding particles to stick to the plane surface. And then the next thing that you have is the friction. However, it is not much useful in this case, so we'll not be taking it up right now. And now just like the particles interact with the object having the collision settings, they can also be influenced by a simulated force field effect. To understand this this in a better way. First I'll delete the plane object in the scene. So press X to delete it. Now to add some force field effect, press Shift plus A, and in this add menu, you have a separate category known as the force field. And in this category, we'll be selecting the wind. And now the function of this wind is that it will apply a force on the particles in a particular direction and with a particular amount of strength. And to modify these things, we need to open the physics properties, and in this we have the force field physics applied and the type is selected as wind. Now to understand all these things practically, I'll take the pointer back to the frame number 1, press the space bar to play the animation, and now you can see that all the particles are falling in the downward direction. However, if I select the wind and in the physics settings, if I increase the strength of the wind to something like 4 or 5 and take the pointer back to the frame number 1 and play the animation again, then now you can see that because of the strength of wind, the downward movement of the particles is now getting slower. Now let's do this again, but this time with a much higher strength of the wind force. So in the strength, I'll type a number like 25 or 30, and now if I play the animation again, then now you can see here that instead of falling down, the particles are now moving in the upwards direction due to the effect of wind. So in simple words, the particles will get influenced according to the strength of the wind. If it is very low, only the speed of the particles will get reduced. However, if we set a very high number in the strength, then in that case, the direction of the particles will change, and instead of falling downwards, they will begin to move in the upwards direction. So you can try to set different values of strength and get a different result each and every time. If you reduce the strength, the particles will move down, and if you increase it, they will begin to move in the opposite direction. And basically this is how the particles in the scene are influenced by the force field effects. And moving ahead, we'll now be exploring about the second type of particle system, which is the hair particle system. So firstly, I will be deleting this UV sphere and the wind. So let's select both of them and press X to delete. And to understand about the hair particles, we'll be adding a new UV sphere in the scene. So press Shift plus A, go to Mesh and select the UV sphere. To give it a smooth look, right click and select Shade Smooth. Now to add the hair particle system, go to the particle properties, click on the plus button and change the particle type from emitter to the hair particles. Now we have these long strands of hair which are added on the surface of the UV sphere, and these hair particles are used to create various things like grass, fur, hair particles of any character. So we can say that the hair particle system is a very useful thing in Blender. Now in the hair particle settings, the first thing that you have in the emission tab is the number, and this value controls the number of hair particles which are added to the surface of the UV sphere. By default, its value is set to 1000. Then you have the seed value, which will give you a random result of the placement of hair particles each and every time. Now to control the length of these hair particles, we have the hair length option. So if I reduce this value, then the length of the hair particles will reduce, and now this is how the UV sphere with the hair particles is looking in our scene. Also, with the reduced hair length, we can now clearly see the actual position of the hair particles on the UV sphere. Now since we'll be understanding about the different settings in the hair particles, and we'll also be creating a simple UV sphere object with some colored hair particles, so we should also increase the number of these hair particles. So go to the number and let's increase it to something like 8000 or 10,000, and with this we have a much higher number of hair particles which are being emitted out of the surface of the UV sphere. Now suppose you want to assign any particular material to these hair particles, then to do this, let's first go to the material preview mode, and with the UV sphere selected, go to the material properties, and we'll be creating a new material. Let's change the base color, and I'll be selecting the red color, and now you can see here that the hair particles are getting the same material which we applied to the UV sphere. But suppose you want that the UV sphere should be red colored, but these hair particles or the fur should be of some other material. Then to do this, we need to create a new material, then go to the base color, and for this one, I'll be selecting the pink color. Now to assign this pink material, which is named as material.001, we need to go to the particle settings, and in the render tab, you have this option of material, and from this list, select the material.001. And now you can see here that the UV sphere is having the red material and the hair particles on it are having the pink material. Now in the particle settings, we also have an option at the top which is the advanced, and if I turn it on, then in this case, it will allow us to control some more settings like the velocity and the physics. So it's always better to keep this on while creating the hair particles. Now if I zoom in, then here we can see that we have some gaps in between the hair particles, and if you want to fill these gaps, then for this we need to use the children settings in the hair particles. So in the children tab, select the interpolated, and now you can see that all the gaps in between the hair particles are now filled with the children hair particles. And to view the hair particles properly in the scene, we'll also switch to the render view. Now these hair particles or this fur on the UV sphere is properly visible in the render view. Now moving ahead, the next important settings in the hair particles is related to the physics. So let's open this physics tab, and in this, the first setting that we have is the physics type, and by default it is set to Newtonian. And the Newtonian physics type is basically a simulation method which uses the Newton's laws of motion, which we also see in the real life, in order to calculate the behavior of the individual hair strands. So in most of the cases, to get realistic hair particles, we'll be selecting only the Newtonian physics type. However, if I change it to the Boyd's physics type, then you can see here that we are getting a very much complex result. And this is because the Boyd's physics type refers to a technique inspired by the bird flocking behavior. It is used to give a more natural and a dynamic look to the hair simulation, and in most of the cases, you only have to use the Boyd's physics type when you're using some force fields like the wind in the scene. But for now, I'll be changing the physics type back to the Newtonian. Similarly, in the physics tab, we also have some forces where the first one is the Brownian, and if I increase it, then it will make the hair particles exhibit some random movements, and therefore it looks like this. So if you want to give your hair particles a random look, then you can try to increase the value of the Brownian forces. Similarly, when you are making hair particles for animals, then you can use the damp forces in the physics tab. So in this way, you can change the way how your hair particles look in the scene with the help of these forces. Now moving ahead, if I open the source settings in the emission tab, then over here we have an option which is known as the particle per phase, and this basically controls the number of particles on each phase, and when its value is set to 0, it will automatically take a value and assign it as the number of particles per phase. However, if I try to manually increase it to something like 6 or 7, then you can see here that these hair particles are kind of combined together, and this is because with the particles per phase value equal to 6, it is now emitting 6 hair particles from each and every phase. But for now, I'll change it back to 0. Also, I'll reduce the Brownian forces to something like 0.05 or 0.1, and this will give a realistic look to these hair particles. And so basically these are all the settings that are mainly used in order to create the hair particles for any object. And yes, we'll be exploring some more options in the upcoming chapters of this course while understanding about the character creation. Now let's also try to create some duplicates of this UV sphere with all these hair particles, and we'll be assigning different colors to each of them. So first of all, select the UV sphere. Let's also go to the object mode in order to make our work faster. And now to create a duplicate, press Shift plus D. Let's move it in the y-axis and place it over here. Let's create one more duplicate and place it over here. Now let's go back to the render view. Let's also add some lighting on this part. So select the lamp, press Shift plus D to create a duplicate and move it in the y-axis. Now we'll be selecting this UV sphere with the hair particles in the middle, and to give it some different color, let's go to the material properties and click on the plus button. Now we'll be creating a new material, and for this material, we'll be choosing the base color as the orange color. However, to apply this material on these hair particles, we need to do some changes in the particle settings. So with this particle system selected, if I scroll down, then in render, I can change the material from here. So from this list of materials, I'll select the material.002, and now we have this orange colored material applied to these hair particles. Similarly, let's select this one, open the material properties, and let's create a new material. So click on the new button, let's change the base color from here, and we'll be choosing the green color in this case. And with this, we now arrive to the end of this chapter. Today we learnt about the particles interaction, the force field effects, and in the end, we also understood about the hair particles in Blender. So our next chapter will be the chapter number 64, rigid body physics. So don't forget to subscribe to our channel, press that notification bell so that you can get timely updates about the upcoming chapters. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.